On behalf of the Observatory on Latin America, OLA, of the New School, I am pleased to welcome you all this evening to the public lecture of our first President Nestor Kirchner Fellow. The OLA was formally launched at the New School in September 2006 by the current Argentine President, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. The OLA is working during a time of political change and renewed interest in Latin America. New leaders in the region are seeking new policies and approaches to strengthen democracy, to define new economic and social policies, and to achieve social justice in their countries. The OLA has three main objectives. First, to study and observe the process of political and economic change in Latin America. Second, to link institutions in the US and Latin America by strengthening understanding of the challenges of building social democracy in a globalized world. We have created opportunities for Latin American leaders to directly speak to audiences in New York, and in the last 3 years, the OLA hosted around 40 events in the New School. The third objective is to mobilize resources and ideas together with Latin American institutions to further these goals. The work of the OLA is organized around 5 themes. You can see some of them there. First, the President Nestor Kirchner Fellowship program. Then the Latin America on the Move program, which brings speakers to New York. Among them have been Tabaré Vázquez, President of Uruguay in 2009, Ollanta Humala as a presidential candidate from Peru in 2010, Néstor Kirchner several times, and the last in 2010, and recently Rafael Correa, President of Ecuador. Other senior officials from the region have also spoken at the university, including Ambassador Arguello, present here, and Ambassador Pérez Gabilondo, also present here. Another program is the Building Latin American Bicentennials, which has held 2 international calls for papers and audiovisual presentations, and which has put the OLA on the map by receiving almost 1 million hits during the last academic year. Design and Social Development is a new collaborative program, and finally, we have a new space in honor of grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo. All of this can be seen, as you can see, in the OLA website. And now I am honored to introduce our president, David Van Sant.
Thank you, Margarita. And as she said, my name is David Van Zandt. I'm the president here at the New School. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for the Observatory in Latin America's first public lecture for the President Nestor Kirchner Fellowship. The Kirchner Fellowship program is a joint effort between the New School and the Universidad Nacional de San Martin in Buenos Aires. The program supports the training of young leaders in South America who are currently engaged in public service or completing their postgraduate training in a related field, with the aspiration of working with public service organizations of the state or in registered non-governmental organizations. The fellowship program is managed by Margarita Gutmann of the New School's Observatory in Latin America and by Claudio Angerflon, the director of the University of San Martin. The fellowship program was established through the generous support of Julian Studley, who's here with us tonight. Julian, welcome. And the Universidad Nacional de San Martin. I would also like to acknowledge the efforts of Ambassador Jorge Arguello, Ambassador Jose Perez Gabilondo, and Juan Manuel Abal Medina, the Argentine Secretary of Public Communications, to ensure this program's success. The idea is the fellows will come to the New School for 2 weeks, where they'll get to interact with New School faculty and students, as well as hold seminars and a public lecture, which this is tonight. This provides, we hope, not only academic feedback for the individual fellows' work, but also an international knowledge exchange with the community here at the New School. The program was launched this past spring of 2011, and we received about exactly 103 applications from 11 countries in South America. I think we can all say that the response was really overwhelming beyond our expectations. The applications were reviewed in a very lengthy process by a distinguished international panel of 55 jurors from Latin America and the United States, including some New School faculty. Then a group of 21 finalists were selected and evaluated by a final jury, which met in Buenos Aires this past summer. Both Ambassador Arguello and I had the pleasure of participating as members of that jury with distinguished scholars and civil society leaders. We awarded 3 fellowships for this current year, for 2011 and 12. The first fellow, who we'll hear from tonight, Lucila Rosso, is from Argentina. And the 2 others will be coming to the New School in February. They are Rica Paredes Sanchez from Ecuador and Mauricio Santoro Roca from Brazil. So let's begin tonight, this inaugural lecture, by welcoming Ambassador Jorge Arguello, who is currently the permanent representative of Argentina to the United Nations and chair of the G77 countries. But I'm also really pleased to be able to announce tonight that Ambassador Arguello was named Argentine Ambassador to the United States as of November 9th by President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. Congratulations. I'll say the only downside to this new position for you is that we will miss you in New York. But we wish you the best, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much. Good evening to all. First of all, I would like to thank the New School University and the National University of San Martin, Argentina, for asking me to introduce the first recipient of the President Nestor Kirchner Fellowship in her public lecture here at the Orozco room. This university reminds us of the late President Néstor Kirchner, his last visit to New York, and his last statement, international statement. Néstor Kirchner was visiting the financial and cultural capital of the United States during a critical moment for the world, when the global crisis caused by the speculation frenzy was still raging. President Kirchner, of course, alluded to the crisis to underscore the lessons he had learned in South American region and to properly assess the pro-cyclical policies in almost all the countries in the region. Kirchner reminded us that his government has successfully increased reserves, paid the foreign debt, lowered financing costs, and deepened debt reduction. He added that thanks to the debt swap, the renegotiation of the debt, and cash payments to the IMF, he was able to set the country free from flawed policies, which, as he said that day, some countries are still paying. He noted that while the Mercosur had allowed a common economic project, it was through UNASUR that was provided the answer to the search for a political framework of development with justice and fairness, human rights, and democracy. A political union conceived on the basis of, and I'm going to quote Nestor, the resolve to dare to think differently from our own relative truth in private, and the decision to discuss with the big blocs in public. For a resolute man like Kirchner, it was easy to summarize UNASUR's philosophy to students. Respect for democratic pluralism, respect for the people's sovereign will, respect for human rights, respect for freedom of speech, endorsement of solidarity policies that aim at social inclusion, as well as enduring solidarity between peoples. As you know, the objective of the President Nestor Kirchner Fellowship is to encourage the training of young leaders with a South American and Latin American vision. This is why the jury of which I am a member, decided to award the first President Néstor Kirchner Fellowship to Lucila Rosso, not only because of her excellent qualifications, but also because of her willingness and commitment. I believe the legacy of Néstor Kirchner, both as late president of my country, of Argentina, and as the first Secretary General of UNASUR, must live on through concrete initiatives such as this fellowship. The world is changing rapidly, and developing countries must play a prominent role in the configuration of power distribution. After the failure of the economic recipes in the 90s, we learned that it is essential for our countries to have our own visions, The construction of this new paradigm is achieved through action, as Néstor Kirchner proved. To ensure the continuity of his legacy, it is essential to promote the academic debate and to prepare our young leaders for the challenges to come. To that end, the President Néstor Kirchner Fellowship plays an essential role. Each fellow will present his or her work and experience to academic, political, and social leaders here in New York, and such exchange will, in turn, enrich the fellows' work. Lucila will be sharing her work, which reveals a rigorous combination of political and economic methodology in her analysis of the restructuring and cancellation by both Brazil and Argentina of their debts to the IMF. Lucila's work shows the difficulties that the governments of Argentina and Brazil had to face in opposing the demands of the International Monetary Fund. But also, it helps to understand the decision of both Brazil and Argentina to cancel their debts with the IMF. I must admit that the decision of the jury was exceedingly difficult to make, given the quantity and quality of good works that were presented for consideration. David was reminded that we had received 103 works, so we had to read a lot. And we are glad, because we all learned a lot also. So I am glad to say that Ms. Rosso's essay represents the spirit of the fellowship Néstor Kirchner, and she combines leadership and professionalism with relevant experience in public administration. That is why today it is my pleasure to welcome Lucila in New York and to present her to all of you. Lucila. You have the floor. There you
go. Well, hi. Thank you, all of you, for coming here. First of all, I'd like to thank the OLA and the New School for the opportunity that this fellow is for me. I want to thank all the staff of New School, the faculties, the students, for all the comments that I receive on my work. I'm sure that the comments will help me to improve my work a lot, so thank you very much. Especially, I want to thank Margarita and Mike for your support during my stay here. Finally, I want to thank the Ambassador Arguello and President Van Sant for being here introducing me. It's an honor for me, so thank you very much. And well, now we are going to talk about the debt prepayment of Argentina and Brazil with the IMF. This is a work in progress of my master's thesis. And regarding that, I would first like to clarify some things about tonight's presentation. First of all, as this is an international relations study, I will leave aside the economic details of the measure and take into consideration only that economic information that is relevant to the measure that we are talking tonight. Secondly, during this presentation, I will mainly focus on Argentina's cancellation, prepayment, because Brazil's prepayment is the next part of my work. So it's a huge work. Let me tell you which will be the structure of the tonight's presentation. First of all, I will start talking about why I think it's relevant to study this measure. And then I'm going to go into the systemic and domestic considerations of that measure. That considerations that I think made this prepayment possible. So why I decided to study this measure and why I think it's relevant. First of all, because I think it shows a relevant shift in the foreign policy of both South American countries. In the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the IMF took the lead in promoting the political and economic reforms needed to strengthen neoliberal policies, formerly seen as a sole way of achieving growth and development. For Latin America, this resulted in a series of reforms based on the Washington Consensus. During that time, in exchange for credit lines, the IMF made sure that these structural reforms were carried out. While the Latin American state obtained and renewed its loans, their foreign debt increased, as well as the power that the IMF had over the government's economic decisions. The IMF, as we can see, worked as a government's guarantor for the markets, so it was vital for Latin American countries to befriend the fund, and in this light, they had to accept new conditions from the fund. After a decade marked by these dynamics and the close relations with the United States, on December of 2005, Lula administration prepaid the total debt the Brazil had with the fund, and a few days later, on January of 2006, President Néstor Kirchner followed suit, paying the almost $9.6 billion that the Argentina owned to the fund. Bearing this in mind, the fact that both states prepaid the debt they held with the fund raised several questions. What were the determinants of this measure, and what actors were involved, and how did they manage to intervene in it? But above all, why would it be relevant to understand why and how both the major countries of South America decided to change their relation to the IMF? As possible answers, I presume that the measure displays the change of path in South America. I mean the breakaway with neoliberalist tenets and the search for more autonomy. Also, this allows us to know the profoundness of this change and is a key element in understanding the position that South America wants to take in the world. Secondly, the measure is additional evidence for the need to rethink the IMF and international financial institutions. And last but not least, the measure is relevant, the study of the measure is relevant in the context of crisis in Europe and in the US, which were suggested to implement the programs that South America, and in particular Argentina, did not apply in order to overcome their crisis. So, regarding the theoretical framework I have explored during these 2 weeks of intensive work, I have the opportunity to talk about my paper with a lot of you and people who's not here. And everyone gave me new perspectives to my work and to introducing my work. So I will leave aside this debate in this lecture, but there are several papers which attempt to explain why the countries enter into agreements with IMF, and a few that try to explain why the agreements with IMF reach an end or terminate. So, going into the considerations, Changing the topic. What were the systemic considerations that I take into account in this study? First of all, after reaching its peak of prestige during the 90s, and after the crisis in Southeast Asia, Brazil, and Russia, the fund was receiving harsh criticism from political and academic circles all over the world. It was mainly accused of cooking up homogeneous recipes for all the indebted countries and offering bailouts that only encouraged foreign investors, all of which was far from solving the crisis. Later, Argentina's downfall in 2001 would evidence the ineffectiveness of the IMF, such as its economic policies, to manage the crisis. Secondly, the IMF was experiencing a period of financial instability caused by the high number of unpaid loans and the high risk of non-recoverable ones granted during the last years, which in turn reduced the liquidity of the fund and the capacity for self-financing and credit lending. Consequently, it adopted a new approach, one which was more reluctant to grant loans and aimed to recover outstanding debts and decrease future lending. Also, this matched the direction with Bush administrations took towards the IMF, and that the fund followed when Hersh Kohler became managing director in 2000, a policy of promoting smaller loans in which the terms and conditions were established a priori and a greater activity from the private sector. What did this mean for Latin America? That to acquire a loan at the beginning of the new century, the South American states had to engage in long and complicated negotiations with the IMF, which were formally easier. Thus, a successful outcome was more difficult to achieve than it was in the past decade, even more if the requesting state was one of the greater debtors of the fund, as was the case of Argentina and Brazil. Taking this into consideration and the fact that the measure was welcomed by the IMF, it's possible to consider this new position as a facilitator for both South American states to prepay the debt they owe to the fund. And last, we also have to consider the changes in the governments of Argentina and Brazil. When they took office, Lula and Kirchner stressed the need to restore the autonomy and independence lost during the 90s due to the conditions imposed by the IMF to approve financing programs. And unlike the neoliberal governments of the 90s, who prioritized fiscal balance over national development, both Argentina and Brazil focus on development as their main objective in their national and national platforms, which could not be achieved without an active state's intervention to handle the economy and to fight social inequity. In this light, what has happened in Argentina? I'm going to start highlighting some of the decisions carried out by Eduardo Duhalde, the former president of Néstor Kirchner, because it was in that moment, after the 2001 crisis, that the relationship with the fund started to change. What was the context? When Duhalde took office, Argentina was in a severe social, political, and economic crisis, and in fact, we had 5 presidents in 10 days. The political crisis was so deep that Eduardo Duhalde was elected as a head of state by the National Congress, which is a constitutional but extraordinary way to become a president. He confirmed that the country was moving away from convertibility and from the partial default that the former president had settled with external private creditors. The government believed that an agreement with the IMF would provide disbursement to reactivate the economy, restore the reserves, recapitalize banks, and obtain loans from another international financial institutions, such as the World Bank and the ITB. At the same time, this measure won't prevent the country from isolation and greater instability. Since the payments to international credit institutions had not been declared to be in default, the new administration tried to enter into an agreement with the IMF to overcome the crisis. To attain this goal, the first strategy of Duhalde's administration was to restore the relationship with the developed world in order to gain their support in the fund. Thus, the government complied with many of the requirements imposed by the fund, but as they were met, the IMF renewed its conditions, putting off the signing of the agreement. Because of the change in the IMF position, negotiations for a new agreement with dual administration were tough and protracted. The IMF was more inflexible than it was during the 90s, when the unmet conditions were frequently forgiven and loans were extended. Now, the fund established a number of conditions to comply with before the signing of the agreement, and notably reduced the grants the funds granted to the country. In addition, Kaller, the IMF managing director at the time, was resistant in offering Argentina a new loan. He believed that the country had to pay the consequences for their irresponsible actions during the crisis and overcome it alone. So this change in the IMF attitude shaped a new relation with the IMF. As a result, the government's negotiations with the IMF became stricter until the government announced that it could not meet the deadline with the World Bank in 2002 without a guarantee of a new agreement with the IMF, because the country has scarce reserves. So this announcement worried G7 countries who feared that the crisis that was unfolding in Brazil, Uruguay, and Turkey could aggravate their economies. In turn, they placed some pressure on the IMF to sign the agreement with Argentina, despite Kaller's resistance. Finally, 1 year later, the IMF approved a transitional standby agreement with Argentina, which was supposed to lay the foundations for a more comprehensive program that was to be developed after the elections. But instead of an agreement for new and fresh loans like in the 90s, the program did not involve net disbursements, but rolling over the debt until the end of the 2005. And the interest of it were going to be paid off with reserves. As we can see, what led to the final approval of the agreement were not economic reasons, but the political pressure that the developed world placed on the IMF. What happened when the new government took office? When Néstor Kirchner became president, some months later, Argentina was still in default with international private creditors and still in a difficult economic and financial situation, but with an increasing level of reserves, mainly due to the surplus in the balance of trade. From the beginning, Kirchner announced that the position of the government in the negotiations table with the fund were going to be tougher, and in this light, the government started to tie the payment of the debt with the growth rate of the country, giving priority to the economic growth and social equity. Actually, in his opening speech, Kirchner asserted, and I'm going to quote him, that he would neither return to the increasing state of indebtedness nor to the cancelling of the debt at the expense of the exclusion and hunger of the Argentinian people. The unfeasibility of the old model can be perceived even by creditors themselves, who need to understand that they will be able to collect only if Argentina does well. If our country expands, he said, so will our credit trust. At the same time, he stated that this new tenet did not imply not paying the debt and defined it as a new model with production, work, sustainable growth, and clear rules will generate fiscal solvency, stability, and resources, which will in turn allow us to establish logical negotiations and therefore reduce the foreign debt. From that moment, Kirchner followed this guidance and also remained firm with a critical viewpoint towards the IMF. So, Kirchner initiated negotiations to enter into a medium-term program with the IMF. With it, Argentina had 3 goals. First of all, use the disbursement to compensate at least for the payments the government had made to the fund. Second, have access to development policy credits of the World Bank and the IDB, for which the supervision of the IMF was crucial. And third, obtain the fund's support prior to the offer to restructure the debt with the private creditors. But at that time, there were 2 factors that provide Kirchner with more room to negotiate. There was a change in the US attitude towards the negotiations between Argentina and the IMF after the 9/11, The US wasn't actively involved in the negotiations, but intervened only at critical moments. In fact, in the first meeting with Kirchner, Bush encouraged him to negotiate firmly with the fund. Second, Kirchner was aware of the fact that the self-financing capacity of the IMF was in trouble, so he used both factors to unlock negotiations for the agreement, and taking Waldeck's experience with the fund into consideration, when a due date with the IMF approached, he put more pressure and announced that he would not authorize the payment, entering into a default with the fund. Owing to the magnitude of the loans already granted to the fund, Kirchner's decision placed a strain on the IMF's financial situation. Later, as the US policy settled, the State Secretary for Latinoamerican Affairs, Roger Noriega, asked for flexibility from the fund, and the government finally reached a new medium-term program, who actually was the same as Dualde's administration, but has, in a way, was considerably unusual because it set quantitative objectives only for the first year, and the issues that were the most problematic were not sufficiently addressed. Nonetheless, the agreement was functional from both parties. Argentina restored its possibility of receiving loans from international credit organizations, and at the same time displayed a willingness to negotiate. On the other side, the IMF reduced its borrowings and its credit exposure, and reestablished itself as a player in the recovery process of the country. However, the signing of the agreement didn't settle the unstable relationships, and the approval of the first two revisions of the agreement gave way to even more tense negotiations and statements. The conflicting issues can be summarized into two key points. The first one, despite the fact that the IMF recognized that macroeconomic and fiscal targets were more than satisfied by Argentina in the first two revisions, the IMF considered that the government didn't comply with some structural reforms. Argentina argued that it had complied with them, but in a manner that would not affect the country's economic growth, policy, the poverty reduction, and the employment. Secondly, although at first the fund policy was to remain a part of the debt swap in default, the foreign private creditors started to push their governments that were represented at the board, at the IMF board, shifting the fund's position. This attempt to intervene in the national economy made the government more uncompromising, and the IMF's board began to postpone the agreement revisions as an answer. As a result, Kirchner decided to stop negotiations until the debt swap with the private creditors was completed, dropping the revisions and making the agreement unilateral and virtually suspended. However, Argentina continued the payment of the refinanced debt with its reserves, which was the beginning of the debt relief policy, as the government will later call it. Almost 2 years later, on January of 2006, in an unexpected press conference, President Kirchner announced the total prepayment of the debt with the IMF. And in his speech, although he outlined the most important economic characteristics of the transaction and listed the main economic facts that allowed the prepayment to be possible, maybe as a measure of stability and calmness to international financial markets, he highlighted the political implications of the payment, the search for a greater autonomy and independence from the IMF. There are several important paragraphs of this statement, but I would like to stress two that I think are crucial to understand the political motivations of this measure. Kirchner said, "We want to take this crucial step that will allow us to see our future without impositions, with autonomy and quietness, without urgency imposed or undue pressure. This is a step that helps us build, with all responsibility, a more fair, inclusive, and equitable future with greater flexibility in the design and the execution of economic policies, a step that will give us resources and better tools to fight for growth, employment, and social inclusion. This is a step that means the end of an era." In this statement, Kirchner also criticized the credit institutions and its performance during the 90s and in the 2001 Argentina's crisis. He said, "The debt with the IMF has been a constant vehicle for interference because it is subject to scheduled revisions and it has been source of more and more demands. Demands which go against the goal of sustainable growth," showing with that statement the political motivation of the measure. Although from the beginning of the new administration announced that they would take a tough and uncompromising stance in the negotiations with the IMF in order to regain autonomy in the design of the national politics, the decision to cancel the debt was not part of the initial program of government. However, there is evidence to support that it had been considered by the president when the negotiations for the standby became standard. The Brazil prepayment announcement, the good reception this measure had within the IMF and in the markets, stimulated Kirchner to go for it too. To conclude, I think it's possible to postulate that convergent interests allow for the prepayment. During all the entire negotiation process, the demands of the IMF shifted and intensified, complicating the autonomy of the new administration. With respect to the IMF, it maintained a policy of credit reduction ratified by its executive director, who had suggested that Argentina use their national reserves to pay the debt. In economic terms, the measure had a relatively small impact. Even though the government saved $900 million in interest, the total debt with the IMF represented only 7% of the full state foreign debt. Also, the debt at nominal value remained similar, but instead of having debt with the IMF, the Treasury had it with the central bank, which implied obviously more friendly currency at better interest rates. However, the small economic impact of the prepayment highlights the importance of the political considerations involved in the final decision to sustain the autonomy of the government by defining a non-intervening relationship with the IMF. Finally, how did the systemic factors reviewed at the beginning influence in the Argentina decision? The loss of prestige suffered by the IMF since the turn of the 21st century gave Argentina's government more room for negotiation. The long and tense discussions of Dualde and Kirchner administrations and the resistance to the imposition of IMF conditionalities support these, although some agreements were reached. Simultaneously, from 2002, Argentina's economic and fiscal situation was improving, allowing the country to enjoy new levels of economic growth and successive commercial surpluses, in spite of the past decade when deficit and external restrictions were commonplace. This situation strengthened Argentina's position in the foreign field and reduced the urgency for external financing. Also, the successive economic surpluses allow for an accumulation of international reserves, which will later be used for the prepayment of the debt. This economic context, at the same time, converged with the IMF policy to reduce its credit exposure by initiating the recovery of credits. Last, but not least, the progressive political standing of Kirchner administration was key to the decision adopted in this particular situation. The government weighed the improvement in the domestic economy with the diminishing prestige of the IMF and took advantage of these conquering factors to reshape the country's relationship with the IMF without breaking connections with the credit institution. In this sense, although there was a national and international context that favored the measure, the political considerations of the prepayment of debt to the IMF are considerably important. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Lucila. That was excellent. So But now we have an opportunity to ask her questions. So who would like to? Yeah, would anyone like to start? I can probably kick it off by asking. Part of this is my lack of knowledge of Argentinian history, recent history. But what role did moving away from the currency board play, and how did that impact how the IMF thought about?
You mean the convertibility?
Yeah, convertibility with the dollar.
Well,
the pegging.
Well, the moving away of the convertibility was the problem. What make we produce the crisis
feeling,
better than the moving away of the convertibility, the effects that the convertibility had during the 90s. So this was the last thing that make the country go into a crisis. Within the IMF, the measure was discussed, and there were different positions in the IMF. But the thing is that I think that the most important thing here is that when Kirchner took office, the problem of the objective of the government was to overcome the crisis. Mm-hmm. So without the convertibility, in fact with the negative effects that the convertibility had during the 90s, there was a difficult situation. And that's why the government and the IMF go into difficult negotiations, I think.
Yeah. But was the IMF position, though, that it never should have moved away from convertibility? And therefore now we've got to come in and bail you out, so to speak?
Sorry, do you ask
Was
me?
the IMF, I was just wondering from their motivation, the IMF's motivation politically, was it the fact of moving to convertibility that made the negotiations, the IMF was taking a harder line on that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure I'm asking a reasonable question. Go ahead.
I was intrigued by this comparison between Argentina and Brazil, and I know you mentioned you're going to be studying.
Sorry for that.
But nonetheless, in 2011 now, you have Brazil, which is considered in some respects to be an orthodox participant in international finance. And some people are not sure that Argentina has orthodox economic policies. But I would appreciate your perspective on foreign direct investment, because some people say that Brazil right now has too much foreign direct investment. And there is some concern that I've been reading in the press that although the Argentine economy has done well, there's not much foreign direct investment coming into Argentina. So I would be interested in your perspective of the future of Argentina internationally, economically, the role of foreign direct investment, perhaps in comparison to Brazil.
Well, I'm not an economist, so this is a difficult question. I'm a lawyer, in fact. I have problems with economists. Well, but the last statement of our president was that the foreign direct investment levels were the highest of the process of recovering. But I can discuss this because I'm not acquainted about that specific issue. But I can give you my perspective of the future of Argentina, and this is one of the key points I highlight in the presentation. I think that taking into consideration the results of the policy, the government's policy and the managing of the economy in Argentina, and comparing with what's happening in maybe Europe, or so I think that the results come out that there was a good managing of the economy. But I'm a lawyer, so I'm so sorry.
We lawyers can't use that excuse, though. Come on.
That was a very nice presentation. It sounds like you think Kirchner really negotiated extremely well. What advice would you infer from that for the Greeks?
Negotiate firmly and with your convictions. I think that was the key for Kirchner. That's negotiate firmly, you know, and I'm taking care of the interest of the people. That's the most important thing. I think that what's happening in the population of the country, that's the most important thing, I think. But that, negotiate firmly.
Well, actually, follows up my question was probably related to that in the sense of would you recommend to the Greeks they drop out of the euro? Because essentially that's what Argentina did.
I'm a lawyer.
I'm a lawyer. Okay. Okay.
There's a lot of economics here. Why?
Other questions? Anyone?
It was interesting you said that before Kirchner took place, he was not planning to start paying the debt with the reserves. And other people talk right now that there's like an Argentine model facing this. Do you think like it was during his presidency that he was like taking part in some way pragmatically from economic theory or maybe like opportunities in a way he finally finishing constructing this idea of a model? Is that you can see in your investigation?
Yes, I think that what I mean with that it was not part of the initial program of the government, was that the prepayment was not in the mind of the president. But if you analyze all the comportamiento, all the behavior of the government regarding the paying of the debt, you can see that the government was gradually reducing its debt, you know. So, yes, I think that Kirchner saw the opportunity, saw a favorable context, and take the step, you know. But the policy of debt relief was in the mind of the government, I think. The curious thing is, how did they cancel the debt, you know, pay the debt? Yeah, that's, I think, the curious thing, yeah. Not the debt relief policy, but the way they prepay the debt.
Please, Master.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Perhaps we can enlighten us a little bit in one aspect.
Not economic.
No. That's political question.
Okay.
You just mentioned which was the situation of the IMF at the time when the decision was taken in Argentina. And according to your research, does the IMF get any experience or lessons of what happened in Brazil and Argentina, particularly related with the impact of conditionality as a sort of issue which create a reaction or an attitude to react against him in developing countries in a situation like Argentina or Brazil?
Well, the IMF is a difficult institution. You know, my intuition and my study says that they take a lot of years to make a reflection about his behavior, its behavior. Well, there's a reflection from the IMF regarding the economic crisis in Argentina. the independent evaluation office made some reflection or some critics about their compartment, but I'm not acquainted about the result of the prepayment within the fund in the case of Argentina and Brazil. I have to look into that. You gave me a good idea.
Other questions?
Would you like to, if you want, and if you feel comfortable, would you like to expand a little bit of which are the next steps that you are taking in your research?
Well, why not? Well, here I receive a lot of ideas. I'm organizing them. One thing I would like to expand is the characteristics of these new progressive governments in South America. Another thing is to go more deep in the situation of the IMF, and of course adding Brazil experience. And in fact that's the next step, no? Looking into Brazil's prepayment, and that mixing with some literature about the South American governments and this new left that it's in South America.
Do you have some just initial ideas about the differences between Brazil's
and Argentina?
In this
well, they had different histories with the IMF. In fact, Brazil was less uncompromising with the fund than Argentina. I think that's an important point. What else? Well, the crisis in Argentina and in Brazil were totally different. Mm-hmm. Argentina going to a default and Brazil didn't. Mm-hmm. And well, mainly I think that the history of the relation probably will make a difference in it.
Yeah.
I think you do. I know you're looking at the period basically from the 2000s and up the turn of the century, but you made a remark just now about Brazil being less uncompromising in its negotiations with the IMF.
Yes.
Have you looked at, or maybe Brazil took much longer to complete its Brady Bond agreement than Argentina, and in fact Brazil did default and stopped making payments in the mid-1980s.
Okay, yes.
Then again, one of the states, Minas Gerais, tried to do it in 1999, which caused the big Brazilian devaluation. Also, have you looked at a comparison of the way the two countries conducted their privatizations?
Okay.
I think there are some key differences there in the way the Brazilians were able to build up reserves and the way they carried them out.
Okay.
One country got a lot better deals than the other.
Okay, I'm going to look into that.
Yeah, I think Brazil had lower external debt relatively, right, to their size of their economy at the time.
I think the same.
Yeah. Well, yeah, in part, maybe because of the privatizations or other things they did.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Mike?
This comment prompts me to just comment that Lucila's held 2 seminars here for faculty, and I would say that and a lot of faculty came from various divisions to participate. And what was interesting was I think she was effective in bringing the new school faculty to talk to each other about a substantive issue.
That's a very positive result.
And what was so interesting was we had 2 sessions and they were completely different. The faculty had very different views and it was very enriching. So everyone went out, I think, with a smile on their face, feeling this was had been a good experience. So thank you.
No.
Well, you've made our first test at this successful. That's great.
Yes.
Other questions or comments? Here's our opportunity to solve all. We haven't really solved Greece's problem yet. Yeah.
Well, I was going to go back to the foreign direct investment and
Point, yeah.
President here brought up another thing to look at, maybe, and hopefully
Okay.
we'll do this going forward. Foreign direct investment that's bad is the short term.
Yes.
That, goes into the stock markets and bond markets. So I don't know in what proportion Argentina is the recipient of a longer term foreign direct investment. Clearly in Brazil's case, it's been a beneficiary of the longer term investment, and they reacted to the whole financial crisis since 2007 when they started to get more investment flowing in. They reacted by imposing a tax on capital, incoming capital that goes into the stock market to discourage short-term hot money. Is Argentina, have they passed legislation like that, or are they looking at it, or they don't have the hot money issue like Brazil does?
Please go.
The hot money has come into Brazil, and one of the things that's fascinating about Brazil is the fourth largest stock exchange in the world is Bovespa. They have an extensive relationship with the Chicago Mercantile, and they see themselves in Bovespa as being one of the leading stock exchanges in the world. And I remember when I took a group of MBA students down there this past March, and they put this 2% tax, I think. And they did it deliberately because they don't want
it afterwards.
Yeah, they increased it. They don't want that hot money coming in.
That's my point. Yeah.
So right now, the largest source of foreign direct investment in the world is China. The second largest is Brazil. So this is an interesting dynamic, and that was kind of the foundation of my earlier question to you, and you're a lawyer, is what is going to be the future role of Argentina with the rest of the international community from a business viewpoint? And that to me is the intriguing question with all of this great success that Argentina has had in the last decade. How are they going to participate in the world economy beyond the excellent exports of their agricultural sector?
You want me to ask to answer? Please let me research this a little bit more, and then we can discuss it. Yeah. Yes, I'm going to note that the foreign direct investment is a thing to analyze a little bit more to improve the work.
No, this is a very important issue. It's happening in Europe too. It's the same issue. And can an economy recover and be an island of its own? It can do it for a while, but how sustainable is that over a long period, particularly in a globalizing world?
Okay.
But do you look much at the role of, you mentioned the commodities, because I think many people believe that both Argentina and Brazil were big beneficiaries of rapid increases in basic commodity prices in the middle part of the last decade.
Well, Mike has the answer of that, I think.
This was debated earlier, I take it, in one of the sessions.
Well, they clearly had a lot of revenue coming in after 2004, right. And that's the narrative in the Financial Times. But the export earnings don't really kick in until later, and the recovery started in the second half of 2002.
Right.
So those weren't agricultural.
Right. So domestic recovery wasn't driven by external trade. Yeah.
The other point is that the composition of the economy, the 10% share of the economy that's in agriculture, did not change over the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So other things had to have grown at the same time that agriculture grew.
We discussed this in the last seminar,
so
that's why I'm asking for help to Mike.
Have another question?
Yeah, I'm going to come back because I know that we're talking about the economics, but I think the political part was quite important in research you have done. And it was wonder, if you think that there was a political consensus inside the country that this kind of measure can be taken? I mean, because usually here in the US there's sort of a political debate of what to do, or even in Greece. And if you do think this was because it was a huge political consensus, because it was no one really know what to do, that they accept that it was like innovative policy, economic policy of paying the.
You mean if the South American countries talk about this and if they decided together or discuss it?
If it was a political consensus in order to move with that, or he was like it was the strong leadership that without even the political consensus he went through this policy.
Within the country.
Within the country.
Within the country. Well, internationally, I think that the measure was discussed, but not they did not decide it together. I think that they discuss it, or they call each other and say, "Well, I'm going to pay the debt," but I don't think that they decided together or in a convergent way, you know. Within the country, I think in a way it was a surprising measure. Economically, there was a consensus about paying gradually. Nobody paid, but I think that the main problem there was with external private creditors, which were they were against they didn't they were not agree with the privilege of the IMF in the debt, you know. So I think that the main problem was that it was discussed during some days. I remember the newspapers and notice. I think that within the country that was the main problem, but the decision was, as I said, really surprising. It was one day for another, so for the press, you know, for the people. So I think that.
Well, just follow up on that. And again, my history, I don't have a good handle on the timeline of all this. But was the forced? I think it was a forced conversion of dollar accounts into pesos. Did that happen about the same time? And that was fairly politically.
The conversion?
Yeah.
The payment and the conversion.
Yeah.
From U.S. dollars into pesos. That was 2001, wasn't it?
Yes, the moving away from that was in 2001, right. And the prepayment was in 2006.
Well, there was a move away from convertibility, but then there was also a conversion of dollar accounts, I thought, or held by nationals into pesos, which effectively was, you know, a devaluation of private individuals' savings.
Yes, but it was before.
That was before, yeah. Okay, timetable, yeah.
How do you do this research? Do you interview people, or what, is there a source that you can go to the government to get memos, or what?
I interview some people. I have to keep doing that. I have to do that with the politics, the government's officials. Sorry. I research governmental documents and IMF documents. Also, I talk with some journalists, different journalists, in both sides of the ideological realm. Both or three, I don't know. It's a discussion. And well, I that's the source, the main sources of my research at this time. You know, it's a work in progress, so I have a lot of work to do.
Yes, related to what you just said, how do you perceive that people from different sides have perceived this measure? Do they think, if everybody agrees right now, that was a good thing to do, or there are still people that, when you say when you are doing research, you are talking to different journalists or people like, do you feel that the feeling is that it was a good thing having done that, or cancel the debt and get out of the IMF, or there are still people that...
I don't know if it's a discussion now, you know, but when Kirchner prepaid, it was, and the curious thing was that people from the right, state that the government were not too from the left, you know, that the money could be used to, I don't know, social assistance and these kind of things. But the curious thing was that it was people from the right, you know, and it's something to think about. And sometimes in Argentina, the government is accused for both sides, you know, but without I don't know how to say, but without a sufficient evidence about this. And that was happened when the prepayment was announced. Not more economy.
No, when it was, but then the IMF then endorsed the prepayment.
Yes.
And the international banks did as well. So did that make the political right shut up, or
no,
they continue to
the
criticize?
IMF didn't say anything about that, but they welcomed the measure when it was announced. In a different way with Brazil, that's a difference. In the case of Brazil, the IMF said that the measure shows the strength of the Brazilian economy. And in the case of Argentina, the IMF say something like, the measure showed the strength that the government think that the economy has.
Other questions or comments? Yes.
I wanted to know your opinion. We know foreign debt is an incredible problem in South America. Do you think it's an opportunity for individual countries to be able to negotiate their external debt, or we should be looking for some kind of bargaining power among countries in South America to be able to have more power to negotiate our foreign debt?
Well, I think that we must do a distinction here. The problem with countries like Argentina is that as they are the middle income, there's a different strategies that from the smaller countries. So in the case of I'm not a specialist in foreign debt in general, or not now, but the problem is that when in the case of the smaller countries, their debt sometimes is forgiven. You know, it's forgiven. And in the case of the middle income countries, the strategy it's more complicated, and that's why I also think this is a good way to move away from the Trump, from the foreign debt. Yes, I think it's a good opportunity for countries to negotiate each other and I think UNASUR and this kind of integration process are a good way to do that. And in fact, I think that's one of the objectives on this kind of process, yes, to become together and to have a lot more power to negotiate in the international field. So yes, I think it's opportunity, why not? Yes. But we have this opportunity since the last for the last 8 years, and I think South America it's using it, you know.
Yes.
What kind of future do you see for Mercosur?
From America?
Mercosur. For Mercosur.
Mercosur, oh.
I mean, in terms of any forward momentum.
Or UNASUR.
Changing of the topic. Mercosur. There's a thing. I think that Mercosur, a lot. I heard a lot about the overlapping of Mercosur and UNASUR. I think that both are useful for different things. I think that UNASUR is a good place for the South American countries to have a political dialogue. It's a kind of this, you know, a political sphere, but and UNASUR have proved the effectiveness of this kind of processes. Well, Venezuela and Colombia's conflict, and the conflict with Bolivia, with Ecuador too. I think that's why I think that UNASUR is really useful. It's a good. It's not an institution, but well, a good institution. And I think that Mercosur, it's a little bit more. It's older, and Mercosur, it's used. You think states in the Mercosur have developed a lot of complemented policies. They work a lot. I work in that, and I could say that there's a convergence in the different topics that Mercosur works. So I think now UNASUR is going to be this strategic forum, and Mercosur will keep working in that. I think there are different levels, you know, now. That's why I think that they could stay together and for a long time. I don't know. That's a political decision too. If they become one institution itself, but I think that UNASUR it's had to stay as is it, you know, without bureaucratics and without administrative things like Mercosur had. I think it's effective in that way, and it showed that. So that's my view.
Well, we've probably worked you hard enough, but thank you, thank you very much. And you know, it's been very good. Hopefully, you've gotten a lot out of it. I know that we all have. And I think the final thing I would say is that I feel, as I hope you do, Mr. Ambassador, quite justified in selecting you for this prize. So thank you very much.
Thank you.